Hello, and welcome to Election Bites, the Carter Center's snack-sized conversations about important election issues. I'm Soya Ellison. I'm the Director of Storytelling here at the Center, and my guest today is David Becker. He's the founder and executive director of the Nonpartisan Center for Election Innovation and Research. He's also the co-author of The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. And we're going to talk more about that book in just a minute. But first, our topic today is lies, damn lies, and election myths. So I thought I would start by asking you, David, what do you think when it comes to American elections is the biggest damn lie out there?
Well, I think the biggest lie out there is exactly what we wrote the book about, which is that there's this sense that there was something very, very wrong with the 2020 election, that it was stolen, or there are reasonable questions, or there's things that just didn't work right. And the reality is the 2020 election, by any objective measure, was the most secure, transparent, and verified election in American history, and it's not close. We somehow had more verifiable paper ballots, which are really important because you can go back and recount and audit paper ballots long after the voter has left. 95% of all voters voted on paper ballots. Every voter in the battleground states voted on paper ballots. That's much more than we had in 2016, when only about 75 to 80% of all voters voted on verifiable, auditable, recountable paper ballots. Entire states like Georgia and South Carolina had paper ballots where they had none in 2016. States like Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina had much of the states, if not most of the state, had no paper ballots in 2016, all paper ballots in 2020. Those paper ballots were audited in every case. That means we hand counted some of the ballots to compare them to the machine counts and confirm they matched. And then courts reviewed the rules of the election more so than any other election in history. There was more pre-election litigation clarifying those rules. Republicans actually won about 7 out of every 8 cases in that pre-election litigation. There were things that both sides didn't love about the election rules, but the fact is they both knew what those rules were when the polls closed on election night. And then after the election, we had more scrutiny, judicial and otherwise, of the process than ever before. And the process withstood that scrutiny more than ever before. Every single court found that there was no evidence whatsoever of any kind of fraud. We sit here over 700 days after the 2020 election, and still there hasn't been the tiniest shred of evidence brought to any court or law enforcement agency indicating there was a problem. So despite the fact that there was this huge success of American democracy, the process of American democracy, where we had the highest turnout ever in American history, more than 20 million more votes cast than ever before, the highest percentage turnout in American history since universal suffrage and the 19th Amendment. We had very few resources during a very challenging period of time for election officials. And then, of course, we had that global pandemic that hung over the election. Despite all of that, we had this great success. And the big lie is people telling you, don't believe this great success that every court, every piece of scrutiny has confirmed. Believe that your candidate lost because the election was stolen. That is a huge lie. And unfortunately, that lie is really driving tens of millions of people to delegitimize American democracy and line the pockets of the people who are kind of propagating the big lie.
How did we get here? Is that how you think we got here? Because there's money to be made in saying something different?
Well, there's the incentive structure is definitely out of whack right now. I think a lot of us, maybe even naively, thought, oh, there's no way that so many people would violate their oaths of office, violate their duties, violate the principles of American democracy just to achieve temporary political power or to raise some money. Unfortunately, that's not been the case. There are an ecosystem of grifters that have been using the big lie to win party nominations, to gain temporary political power and followings on social media, and then, of course, to raise a lot of money. They're putting out made-up documentaries, and they're holding rallies, and they're charging a cost for every one of those things. That's all that money is going into people's pockets. And we've got to change the incentive structure in some way right now. I'm hopeful that we're starting to do that because a key element of that will be accountability. Accountability for those that have lied, who have committed criminal acts, who've achieved some kind of civil liability through their lies. So whether it's the DOJ investigation, whether it's the Fulton County investigation, whether it's civil lawsuits being brought against grifters for defamation, whether it's bar licenses being revoked, those are the kinds of things I hope will reset the incentive structure so we fix it to some degree.
So you've just, as we talked about, co-written this book with Major Garrett, and it's called The Big Truth. Why did you think it was important to write this book?
Yeah, Major and I, neither one of us went into the post-election period saying we got to write a book about this. We kind of felt like we had to. It was I'm not a writer. This is my first book. It's not something I had ever really aspired to. But in the early part of 2021, Major and I were getting together, and I was serving as CBS News election law expert. And as your listeners may know, Major is CBS News chief Washington correspondent. It started out from the perspective of what I just talked about. Election officials had achieved this great success. The men and women, Democrats, Republicans, all across the country had achieved a higher level of election administration professionalism than we've ever seen before. And they were being battered by lies and abuse and harassment and even threats, death threats. Um, and that really troubled us. I work with, through my organization, the Center for Election Innovation and Research, I work primarily with election officials all over the country. And I know them to be an incredibly patriotic group of people who feel they have a calling to facilitate American democracy and give voters a voice. And it really doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats, but they were being abused, and we initially started out writing a book that was really a love letter to them, to thank them for all of their service. But later in 2021, we started hearing more evidence that what appeared to be kind of a spontaneous protest and violence that had occurred on January 6th was actually the natural result of a conspiracy to attempt a coup on the duly elected incoming president. And as we learned more and more, we decided we needed to write a bigger book about this. So we did write about what election officials achieved, but also all of the damage that has been wrought on our democracy, and hopefully a path out of it. We also, I've been told that the book is a little bit scary at points. There are some scenarios that we think are not predictions. They're not even necessarily likely, but they're possible, given that the path of authoritarian, anti-democratic behavior that some citizens of the U.S. are currently on.
I think that's an excellent segue to my next question, which is, with the midterms, 20 some days away, what worries you most about either election day or its aftermath?
So I'll start out. I probably should start out pessimistic and then end optimistic, but I'm gonna ignore my own advice here and start out optimistic. What I'll tell you is election officials, despite all the abuse, despite the lack of resources, despite the fact that Congress hasn't appropriated extra money for them, despite the fact that some state legislatures have changed laws for no good reason on election officials, my sense is they are ready. They're going to run a good election. We're going to have high turnout for a midterm election. About 50% is what is considered high for a midterm election, probably give or take around there. And there's a lot of important races, and I think voters are going to find when they go to the polls, it's going to be easy and convenient, and the options are still going to be there, and most of them are going to see a very positive experience. So I think I am not worried about the work that the professionals who run elections are doing. They're going to get this done. What I am worried about is the effort to exploit unreasonable expectations about the election by losing candidates that could lead to political violence. So, for instance, one of the things I'm really trying to stress, and I talk to the media now quite a bit and to voters, is don't expect to know anything on election night. We're going to know virtually nothing on election night. And that's not because election officials aren't diligently counting all the ballots. It's because we're going to have some really close races, and close races require more time to verify the ballots, count the ballots accurately, double check them, because margins might be narrow. And because we might have some narrow margins in individual races, we might also not know control of the House or the Senate for quite some time. We never, in a presidential election, we're not waiting on California. because California has such a large margin in a presidential race. But most people don't realize this. California takes longer to count ballots than almost any place else. They've got 52 new congressional districts in California. And if it comes down to control of the House, we might be waiting on California. I mean, there is a scenario where we're waiting till essentially around Thanksgiving to know who controls the House and the Senate. And that doesn't mean there's a problem. It means the process is working, and we need to set expectations properly. Every day, every bit of that process is transparent. Observers from both parties and both all the campaigns will be there. They'll be watching it the whole way. The media will be covering it. Just because we don't know doesn't mean there's anything wrong. But I do suspect that candidates who perceive themselves to be losing will likely try to undermine that process and will likely try to suggest that something is going wrong. And we already know that there are many candidates and others who have no problem crossing the line into inciting political violence in this country anymore. And in that period of uncertainty, we might see people exploiting that uncertainty to incite violence in certain places, particularly if it's perceived, as many people in this country do across the political spectrum, that the other side is so bad that they are not our fellow citizens, they are our enemies. That can justify some pretty despicable behavior, and I'm very concerned about what might happen in the last 2 months of 2022.
I'm not going to let us leave on this
Yeah, thank you.
unhappy note. So, just quickly, even though our time is short, can you just tell me one or two of the most common myths about voting in America that you can quickly dispel for us?
Um, yeah, well, there's so many. So one of them is that a lot of this is a black box that you can't see into it. That it's just that there's partisans who are running it and they don't want anyone to see it. Literally every single part of the voting process is transparent. The hardest part for election officials is they can't get people to come in and see it. I'll be honest with you, the elections process is largely boring. It's incredibly dull. It is a lot of rote nuts and bolts, double checking, redundancies, transparencies, sitting and watching the same thing being done over and over and over and over again for hours. But the voter lists, right now, anyone who wants them can get the voter lists and look at them. The voter lists are public. The voting machines, they do logic and accuracy tests in every jurisdiction in the country prior to an election. You get to see, if you want to go, and election officials have a hard time, you can go and watch and see how the machines are tested to confirm that there's nothing, they're not malfunctioning in any way, that they're tabulating ballots correctly. And it's all done so that almost anyone can understand it. It's very easy to see. The process of counting always has observers and poll watchers watching that process. There's regular updates on the count that are coming in. I mean, all of this stuff is public and transparent, and that's why courts have routinely upheld it, because they know what the evidence actually shows. The best way to see this and to dispel this myth is to volunteer to be a poll worker. There's, if you're a poll worker, you'll see you're getting trained for hours before you show up at the polls. You show up at the polls a couple hours before it opens. That's not because they just want to make sure you're going to get there. It's because you have things to do to check boxes with colleagues viewing you, multiple people checking things at each time. And same for when you leave. Election officials, poll workers don't leave when the polls close. They stay for 3 or 4 hours afterwards. They're double checking everything, and it's all being done under observation. We have one of the most transparent systems in the world, and it's all the more impressive. And this is probably particularly interesting for listeners to the Carter Center, because the Carter Center is really the leader in doing election observation all around the globe. But one of the things the Carter Center knows well is we actually have some of the most complex elections in the world. A lot of the ballots elsewhere in the world are actually fairly simple. One of the things that was mentioned a lot in the aftermath of some of the primaries was, well, France has an election and they can hand count all their ballots right away. Their ballots are a single colored piece of paper in an envelope. That is what you do. You take an envelope with some paper and you put one piece of paper in an envelope, you put it away because there's one race, your member of parliament. That's all there is. In the United States, anyone who's voted knows you've got dozens of races on your ballot. It is not unusual to get dozens of pages on your ballot. That creates really complex elections, and it's remarkable how well we run those complex elections in a completely transparent way.
Well, thank you so much. So that's a good cry for everyone out there to become a poll worker and to be nice to your poll workers. And I want to thank you, David, for joining us for this episode of Election Bites. And I want to thank all of you at home for watching. We hope you'll join us next Thursday, October 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern for I Do Solemnly Swear with Kevin Johnson, who will be talking about the candidate principles for trusted elections. That's an initiative that is being overseen by a number of groups, including the Carter Center, and how you can play a part in ensuring that political candidates uphold some basic common sense democratic norms. Thank you.